الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
السلام عليكم.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والحمد لله رب العالمين، وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. نشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن محمد رسول الله. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى صحبه المختارين. سبحان الله سبحان الله، نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستجيره ونستنصره، فإنه حقا من هدى الله فلا مضل له، ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. اللهم يا علي يا عظيم يا رحمن يا رحيم يا رب، إنا نسألك أن تقسم لنا من خشيتك ما يحول بيننا وبين معاصيك، وأن تقسم لنا من رحمتك ما يقربنا من طاعتك، ونسألك يا رب أن ترزقنا من اليقين ما يهون علينا مصائب الدنيا وأحداثها. So this is the third Jum'ah, and as we speak, Gaza continues to be bombed. And the life of 2.3 or 2 point whatever, 0.4, 0.5 Palestinians remains, to say the least, in the eyes of this world, to not even be worth, leave alone a condemnation of what Israel is doing, but even a serious call for protection or a serious effort of imposing even or calling for even in any serious way the most minimum of protections. It is not just a Jazeera channel, but indeed in this age, whether anyone knows someone in Gaza and sees the images that people send on their own private phones, or whether someone follows a whole host of channels that bring us images from Gaza, Al-Arabi, Al-Ghad, Al-Madayin, Al-Ahdath. They're all channels that broadcast a very grim and terrifying reality. Entire residential buildings being bombed with the type of arsenal capable of bringing down a multi-floor building in one strike. We see residential structures several floors high being hit, crumbling, and then the images that follow of mutilated and injured and obviously deceased as well, bodies being rushed, either carried and deposited at the side of the road, waiting for identification and tagging and bagging, or bloodied, being rushed to ambulances, to hospitals that have simply run out of any resources to actually help the injured in any meaningful way. And the images of people being dug out of the rubble with the inevitable reality that there are many more that without real equipment capable of digging out rubble of cement and metal, we all know that there are many more bodies that remain trapped under the rubble. And then journalists from all over the world reporting that the smell of death all over Gaza is overwhelming. And that Gaza is starting to witness the types of diseases that come from rotting corpse, rotting bodies under the rubble. And yet, the world that we live in and the president that represents our nation considers it some type of moral or ethical defense or even irrelevant factor to claim that the authorities in Gaza are exaggerating the death. This is at a time when every respectable institution that works on human rights, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross itself, knows that the death toll in Gaza is actually much higher than is what is reported. Because what Gaza does report are actual bodies that have been retrieved. In other words, actual corpse of actual dead people. For the majority of these folks with their names and ID numbers, and a certain minority that remains unidentified. And so their true identities are not known. But nevertheless, because of the existence of a body, it is counted as a casualty. But the realization of every human rights organization on the face of this earth that there are scores of people that remain under the rubble. So whatever the death toll that is reported from Gaza might be, the actual numbers, including the actual numbers of children and women and civilians of all types, is actually much higher. And the real number will not be discovered until Gaza is in a position to actually dig into the rubble with heavy equipment and retrieve the bodies that have been trapped and continue to be trapped. The scale of what is taking place is truly mind-numbing and bewildering. Imagine that in these 3 weeks of unrelenting bombardment, these 3 weeks in which we have witnessed entire neighborhoods in Gaza flattened, just before this khutbah, the bombing is not decreasing. In fact, just before this khutbah, what was being reported is a scale of bombing that is unprecedented, even compared to the very first days of the campaign. What is being reported is that there is bombardment by air, by sea, and by ground. So the civilian casualties in no way are decreasing, but indeed increasing out of all control. As Gaza have already ran out of medical supplies, run out of fuel, run out of food. In 3 weeks, the entire Muslim world was only able to relieve Gaza with 20 trucks that went through the Rafah border. And as I said before, that represents no more than 2 or 2.5% of what Gaza needs simply for sustenance and preservation in a single day. But then these particulars, these details that are truly mind-numbing and that give one very serious pause about the morality of the folks that, whether intentionally or not, are making themselves cheerleaders for an actual genocide. After much back and forth, the UNRWA, this is the United Nations organization that is charged and designated by the UN to take care of Palestinian refugees. Mind you, there is a UN organization that is charged with the enforcement and of the Refugee Convention. But as a practical matter, what this organization became tasked with, charged with, was much more than just the Refugee Convention. The High Commissioner's Office for Refugees overlooks the UN Organization for Refugees, which is involved in the caretaking and reporting on refugees and displaced people from all over the world. The United Nations, however, being fully cognizant of the fact that the Palestinian refugee problem was in part created by the United Nations when the United Nations decided to partition Palestine, and the Palestinian refugee problem was born. The UN was fully aware, including Western countries, that the Palestinian problem is going to be particularly trenchant, particularly unsolvable. In the case of all refugees around the world, the full expectation, the full plan is that displaced people, circumstances will eventually change in due time so that displaced people will return to their homes, that there is a home to go back to for refugees and displaced people from all over the world, that regardless of how complicated the issue is, there is always a home to go back to. But the UN, including Western powers, including the United States, knew very well that this was not a possibility in the case of Palestinians, that the UN system is confronted with a unique problem and a unique difficulty. Israelis were displacing Palestinians with no intention of ever allowing them to return to their homes. And because of the permanence of the problem, the durability of the problem, the fact that the UN was fully aware that it has displaced people, refugees from Palestine, with nowhere to go, that whatever supplies that are being provided for these refugees, let me even be very concrete. In the case of all refugees taken care of by the UN Refugee Agency, what is normally provided is aid of temporary status. So you build tents, you build homes, fully planning for these tents or these homes or these schools or these medical centers to be temporary. You don't invest the type of money for any permanent replacement of refugees, because the assumption is always that the problem will be solved in due time and these refugees will return to where they came. But not in the case of Palestinians. Palestinians are the one refugee group in our current UN system, the one and only refugee group where we needed to create UN organization that took care of these refugees with the realization that these generations of refugees will live in a refugee camp and die in a refugee camp. So that makes a difference in the type of resources you ask for, in the type of money you ask for, in the type of schools you build, in the type of hospitals you build, in the type of everything. It is a fundamentally, entirely different endeavor. So that the UNRWA was created with a considerable amount of moral and ethical embarrassment, because this is the one situation in which we were telling these refugees, you might dream of going back home, but we can't force any country to take you. In other words, any country to absorb this refugee population. And we really can't promise you anything better than your current situation. So you are going to, in all likelihood, live and die in these refugee camps. This was the politics of the UNRWA. These were the discussions. Today, we forget that the UNRWA was not created as some type of benevolent exceptionalism in favor of Palestinians. The UNRWA was created because Palestinians were a problem that embarrassed the world, and particularly Western countries. European countries were fully aware that but for the Holocaust, the type of movement towards Palestine would not have been. But for World War II, but for the Balfour Declaration, but for American support for the creation of Israel, the UN, controlled right after World War II by Western countries, created the Palestinian problem. And so UNRWA was created as a particular or as an exceptional solution to an insolvable problem that the West knew fully well that played the most direct and the most critical role in creating, but using the offices of the UN. So when you see that Gaza is being bombed, only 20 trucks being allowed to enter Gaza during 3 weeks of bombarding a civilian, helpless population, and that part of the negotiations for aid to Gaza was the most basic human element: flour for bread. Not flour for bakeries run by Palestinians, not flour for bakeries that are privately owned, or even bakeries that are run and controlled by the authorities in Gaza. That was non-negotiable. Flour for bakeries that are under the control and administration of the authorities in Gaza was non-negotiable. What Israel agreed to is very limited amounts of flour to the only bakery in the entire north of Gaza run by UNRWA. Normally, refugee agencies don't run bakeries. They don't manage bakeries. Normally, the type of food that is distributed to refugee populations is of a particular type that does not include baking bread. But in the case of UNRWA, because UNRWA was forced to be in this bizarre position where effectively they have to act as the cleanup crew for the conscience of the world. The world denies Palestinians a future. UNRWA has to clean up for that. The world denies Palestinians an education. UNRWA has to clean up for that. The world denies Palestinians water, clean water, and UNRWA has to clean up for that. The world denies Palestinians even sufficient food, and UNRWA has to do the cleanup for that. So UNRWA is allowed to receive a limited amount of flour to keep the bakery run by UNRWA working in Gaza. Shortly after that bakery receives the flour, the UNRWA bakery is bombed by Israelis and destroyed. Israel knew fully well, because this is what they've been negotiating about, that what was received was flour because they ran out of flour. And UNRWA was complaining to the UN, you guys put us in the impossible position. You hired us, you pay our salaries. Our salaries are not paid by Palestinians. Our salaries are paid by the UN. You guys hired us and you pay our salaries to take care of an impossible situation. For decades, you keep telling us there is no permanent solution for Palestinian refugees. Should just keep feeding them and keep taking care of them at mere subsistence, basically. Because UNRWA is always strapped for cash and always strapped for resources. And then now, although we shouldn't be running bakeries, but you, the UN, especially, and the role of Western powers in basically tossing the Palestinian problem to UNRWA is a story in itself. And it's an obscene story. So the obscenity is many-fold. It is already obscene that you have a problem in which the world knows fully the human rights predicaments and impossibilities. And you basically toss this problem to this UN organ. But then the UN organ finds itself incapable of performing the tasks that were charged to it. And so it was, but the Israeli authorities were fully aware that the shipment that just entered the UNRWA bakeries was flour, because that flour was inspected by Israeli authorities, approved by Israeli authorities, allowed to reach its destination by Israeli authorities. But shortly after the flour arrives, the bakery is bombed. Now, normally, and this is another layer, normally, when UN employees are killed or injured, the Secretary General not only speaks very loudly, because these are UN employees. So it is, you're hired by the UN, you are in UN, or organizationally you belong to the UN. Your boss, your ultimate boss, is the Secretary General of the UN, and your salary comes from the UN. So, and we have an internationally known treaty that says UN personnel are in a protected status. They are supposed to be immune from targeting, from attacks. In fact, not only that, but most countries, the vast majorities of countries in the world, per this treaty, cannot even sue. They do not even have legal jurisdiction over UN employees unless they commit a common crime like rape or murder. So normally, when UN employees are hurt, it becomes immediately, automatically, it becomes an international issue. Why does it become an international issue? Because it is the employees of the United Nations that have been hurt. And so the Secretary General immediately issues a release about the employees that have been hurt, who is the responsible party, and indeed, in many, many situations, the UN makes it a point to eventually sue or bring a claim against the party, especially if it's a country, that hurt UN employees. There is a famous case by the International Court of Justice about this issue. The only exception are employees of UNRWA. Israel has targeted UNRWA employees so often and repeatedly. Israel has bombed UNRWA schools, UNRWA hospitals, UNRWA installations so often. But we don't hear a peep from the Secretary General. We don't hear a peep from the Security Council. We don't hear a word when people that have immune status working for the UN are targeted and killed. I mentioned in the last khutbah that the genocidal discourse, genocidal narratives coming out of Israeli media is truly mind-numbing. Israelis in Israeli media speak very freely about the possibility indeed what they often term as the imperative of another Nakba, a much greater Nakba. And this is not just theory, but Israeli settlers have been passing out leaflets to Palestinians in the West Bank, warning them, putting them on notice that they must promptly pick up and leave to Jordan, because if they don't, they are threatened with a coming Nakba much greater than the earlier Nakba. So it is not just genocidal narratives freely exchanged and freely thrown around, but you have the Israeli government bragging about forming 600 settler armed groups in the West Bank alone, distributing weaponry to settlers, repeated incidents of settlers attacking Palestinian homes, setting Palestinian homes on fire, with actual written notices, copies of which Human Rights Watch has collected, Amnesty has collected, telling Palestinians, leave or else. Now, whether people realize or not, this is an actual violation of the Genocide Convention, with an absolute deafening silence from the international community and the Secretary General, and so far the Human Rights Council. Finally, after repeated attempts, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court finally responded and said, I will begin an investigation into war crimes committed, obviously by both sides. This just happened. I think it was yesterday. So, because all of us who have decided to speak on this matter as a matter of conscience and principle, all of us, Muslim or not Muslim, who have looked at what happened and looked at the declared Israeli response, we will wipe out Hamas. And immediately what came to our mind are all the other times in which Israel bombed Gaza. And even for some of us, we even remember the days when Israel bombed Beirut, a major urban center, and the type of slaughter that took place then. And we knew that when Israel says, we will respond to Hamas, that they are not going to go after Hamas fighters directly, soldier to soldier, in combat of an armed person against an armed person. We all knew the pattern of Israeli responses. Israel relies on its technological superiority to bomb from the air. And we all knew what bombing from the air means. After all, it is not just there are people like me who grew up their entire life. Israeli bombings of Egypt or Syria or Lebanon was a regular matter. In all the years, with all the bombardments, all the times, I still remember when Israel committed the massacre of school children in Bahr al-Ba'r in Egypt. The Egyptian army carried out a military operation in a port called Eilat. The Israelis were upset about the military operation against their forces in Eilat. The Israeli response came the very next day. But I still remember in the 1970, when the Israeli response was to massacre school children in a school called Bahr al-Ba'r. I still, to this day, remember the pictures of all the mutilated school children. Israel never apologized for the incident. First, Israel said what it says all the time. No, there was a military target, and the Egyptian army was using these children as camouflage or whatever you will, human shields. And then later on, it was forced to admit that there was no military target and said, well, it was a mistake. That was it. Much later on, in the 90s, survivors from Bahr al-Ba'r and their parents attempted to bring a lawsuit against Israel, demanding compensation for the harm that they sustained in the massacre of Bahr al-Ba'r. They attempted to file the lawsuit in international courts, but you can't, because Israel did not submit to jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. So they actually attempted to go to Israel and file the lawsuit in Israeli courts. And the lawsuit was dismissed by Israeli courts. But point is, there are people like me who grew up with the idea of Israeli air power being the response of choice. And so for people who still remember these days, and even for people who remember the bombardment of Beirut, and even if you don't remember either of these things, just knowing what Israel has done in Gaza since 2005, all of us knew what is going to come, and knew that we will see countless children mutilated, destroyed, blown up, killed. We knew the misery that is about to occur. And then for those of us who chose to speak, well, the response of the so-called civilized world was truly terrifying. Students at Harvard find that they've been blacklisted by employers. Law students find offers made to them are rescinded. Professors and academics find that they are treated as if they are supporters of terrorism, or that they are lovers of terrorism, or that they are complicit in terrorism. And you pause and you think, is it really possible? Is it really possible that so many people in this world do not see the obvious ethical issues that we are confronted with. Let me retract and say, okay, so there is a pattern of practice in which Palestinians are always existing below the line of basic rights and basic entitlements. Israel has always demanded, as an occupier, discretion and the benefit of all doubt. Israel, for decades, has said, I am an occupier. Palestinians, there are Palestinians, a small number of Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel. And Israel has insisted that the world has no business looking into how it treats its Palestinian citizens. Israel has insisted for decades that once it displaced Palestinian refugees, threw them off their land, made them the problem of the United Nations, the charge of the United Nations, Israel for decades has been saying, don't bother us about those people. You want to educate them? You go ahead, pay for it. You want to treat them? Go ahead, pay for it. You want to build homes for them? You do it. But don't ask us to be in any way accountable or responsible for the people to be displaced. All we are going to tell you is we will never allow these people to return to their homes. Okay? So now, as to the Palestinians who are under occupation, and Israel as a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, Israel knows what it means to be a power, that to be an occupying power, and to have a population under occupation. What Israel has always said, that whatever the Geneva Conventions say about how we should treat people under occupation, we take exception upon exception upon exception to what the Geneva Conventions say, because, and here fill in the blank, because Palestinians are particularly violent, because Palestinians are Muslim and so they're insane, because Muslims or Islam is an evil religion, because Palestinians are particularly fanatic, because Palestinians are barbarians, because Palestinians are human animals, fill in the blank. But for decades, Israel has always said, whatever the rules of the Geneva Convention, and this was very clear in the famous case by the International Court of Justice that ruled on, among other things, the way that Israel was building walls of separation that created virtual concentration camps for their occupied population. Now, in all of this, Israel has said there is the logic of exceptionalism in itself is that we are threatened, and when we are threatened, our response to the threat does not abide by normal ethical constraints that have been enunciated or memorialized in international treaties or international agreements. And the United States, for many years, has pretty much, like other Western countries, have pretty much every single time said amen. But look at the logic that we've ended up enforcing. Look at the logic that we've ended up teaching the world. You can create a problem, but because of your exceptional status, take no responsibility for the problem. You can create a problem and you can shift the burden of the problem to the nations of the world. And then, not only that, but whenever you deem it important or necessary, you can even pay very little heed and very little respect to the way that the world is carrying the charge for the problem that you've created. But in addition to that, you have pretty much turned what are supposed to be non-dischargeable ethical standards, non-dischargeable moral standards, into merely advisory standards subject to your own discretion, subject to your own evaluation of what of these standards you apply and what of these standards you refuse to apply because you claim you have exigent circumstance, exceptional circumstance. What you've taught the world is the logic of exceptionalism. And what Israel and all those who love to pretend that they are shocked by people who protested and continue to protest Israel's response, the logic of exceptionalism is exactly the same logic that terrorists use. It's precisely. Look, Israel is saying there are bad people. We cannot get to the bad people unless we kill good people. This is the best interpretation. I mean, there's a great deal of racism, and it seems that Israel just thinks all Palestinians are bad people. But I'm just going along with the argument. Israel is saying there are bad people. We cannot get to the bad people unless we kill good people. And please don't bother with us killing. Don't bother us about the good people we are killing because, in other words, give us deference. Give us discretion. Step out of the way as we get the job done of getting to the bad people. So, as many good people we kill is beside the point because our objective is that we're going after the bad people. Well, what logic do terrorists use? The logic that terrorists use is that there are bad people but we are too weak to get to the bad people directly. We cannot strike against Israeli military air bases. We can't reach Israeli military air bases. We can't actually strike against face to face against military targets. So the only way we can get to these bad people is through going through good people, meaning civilians. I'm dumbing it down because I am in a state of actual moral and intellectual dissonance about the ethical stupidity, if not the immorality, the ethical stupidity of people that I expected much better from. The logic of exceptionalism is because our cause is what our cause is. That's what terrorists do. Don't ask us about the price paid in terms of good people, because our ultimate objective is to get to the bad people. What Israel doesn't realize, or maybe it does, I don't know, but what people that I expected would be capable of better ethical thought don't realize is in the same way that when the US invaded Iraq, killed 1 million Iraqis, went around calling Iraqis Hajis. All Iraqi males were Hajis. When it demeaned the Iraqis, when it degraded the Iraqis, it didn't teach them democracy. And it didn't teach them order or the rule of law. What, as an invading and occupying power, it taught the Iraqis is the logic of self-interest, the logic of vindictiveness, the logic of revenge, the logic of raw power. So we created the very boogeyman that we had to then later on slay. In other words, we, the invasion of Iraq, created ISIS, created Daesh, created the immorality of Daesh, created the insanity of Daesh, created the craziness of ISIS. Where do you think a million people have brothers and sisters, have uncles and aunts, have grandchildren and parents? People, when you murder people systematically for a decade, and that's just a decade, you create a social ailment. And then to pretend that, oh, we don't know where ISIS came from. Really? These crazy, insane Muslims. Israel created the very logic, the very boogeyman that it has been confronting since it made very clear that with Palestinians, I embrace the very rationale of exceptionalism. Look at it from, again, a different perspective. The very logic of all the so-called supporters of Israel, because they actually don't realize it, but they are, in fact, harming Israel. If I was a supporter of Israel, I would recognize that the worst thing that has happened to Israel in modern times is Netanyahu and his government. But that's a different subject for a different day. The attitude throughout the slaughter is there is a price to pay. With all the solemnness and all the solemnness of people who embrace ethical pretenses, well, there is a price to pay for moral wrongs. What moral wrong? Well, for Hamas being in control of Gaza. Well, different story. But do we have a single incident in which Israel or its allies in the West have supported a single democratic movement in the entire Muslim world? And the answer is no. In fact, we do exactly the opposite. Israel has gone out of its way to make sure to protect the despotic government of Saudi Arabia and to support and to garner support for the overthrowing and the failure of all the democratic movements during the Arab Spring. But this is just one single incident in a long history. Anyway, the very logic is there is a cost, right? There is a cost. And the cost for Gazans is a blockade, is starvation, is lack of freedom, lack of opportunities. And this is all a cost that Israel claims is acceptable for what it designates as terrorists. But let's be real. Israel doesn't find terrorists in Hamas and Hamas alone. Israel finds terrorists in anyone that opposes the Israeli occupation. Israel started bombing people in the West Bank. It immediately called them militants. It couldn't call them Hamas because it knew that they don't belong to Hamas. But for the long history of Israeli occupation is that if you oppose the occupation, if you're throwing stones, we will shoot you and try you and convict you and give you prison sentences that sometimes are life terms. Some stone throwers have been sentenced to hundreds of years in prison because Israel considers throwing a stone an assault was a deadly weapon. But even if you don't throw stones and you just demonstrate, we could shoot you, we could maim you, we could kill you, and we could prevent an ambulance reaching you, and because you broke the law of occupation. And as we said, Israel says, leave this occupation to our discretion. Don't bother us with the Geneva Convention, and whatever the UN is not our problem, and so we don't want to bother with the UN. The logic we always come back to is the idea of cost. And the logic that Israel wants the world to accept, and the supporters of Israel indeed do accept, is that notion of cost. Yes, we know that there are babies killed. We know that there are children being blown apart. We know that there are civilians, but there is a cost. There is a cost to what? A cost to hurting Israel. And the implied argument is that that cost is acceptable. We haven't destroyed Hamas, but whatever harm we've done to Hamas, it is acceptable. A price of whatever it is, 5,000 civilians killed, 6,000, 7,000, 10,000, it's an acceptable cost. Okay, so what is the cost of destroying Hamas altogether? And I am sure that even if we're talking about 30,000 civilians killed, 50,000 civilians killed, 100,000 civilians killed, we will be told it's a reasonable price. It's an acceptable cost. The very logic is moral precepts are not absolute. Ethical precepts that say you must bear the risk of harm rather than bring a harm to a child is not absolute. In fact, all ethical precepts can be compromised as long as the price is acceptable. So, but look where that logic takes us. What is the acceptable price for Israel's long history of occupation? If you've accepted the very logic that ethical precepts can be compromised for a cost, well, that's a double-edged logic. So then we can leverage that question right back and say, okay, Israel, you've made the displacement of millions of people the UN's problem, not your problem. You made it, and then you didn't even respect the rules of inviolability, of immunity of the UN, who is bearing the problem that you've created. And your supporters have even imposed a bizarre, exceptional logic that the UN will speak up for its personnel in all cases, except when these personnel are targeted and killed by Israel. Okay, Israel, beyond the refugee problem that you've created, how about the problem of the population that you control under the Geneva Conventions, which you've signed? And even if they didn't sign, it doesn't matter because it's supposed to be part of customary international law. But under the rules of international law, what you know is an occupation. You keep annexing land from the land that you occupy, and you know that you're not supposed to do that. You keep altering the topography of the land, and you know you're not supposed to do that. You keep inviting settlers to the land, and you know you're not supposed to do that. You keep kicking Palestinians off their land, and you know you're not supposed to do that. You keep violating the sanctity of mosques and churches and violating the sanctity of the Aqsa Mosque, and you know you're not supposed to do that. You keep arresting people and jailing them without due process, and you know you're not supposed to do that. You keep killing people every week, and you know you're not supposed to do that. You keep doing this, and you have been doing it for decades. By that same logic, What's a reasonable cost for that? You've established the principle. There is a cost. So what is the reasonable cost for 75 years of occupation and brutalization? People tell you, what do you want Israel to do? So they try to throw the problem in your court and say, okay, well, Hamas committed the terrorist attack. So what do you want Israel to do? But by the same token, what do you want Palestinians to do? Don't throw the problem at me, because I can just throw it back right in your face. You've established the principle that killing thousands of innocent people is a reasonable price. The cost. What is the reasonable cost of occupation? Please tell me. Do I like the fact that Hamas goes in and kills civilians? That's disgusting. You know, and I know, that nothing could be more reprehensible. But I'm not an idiot. I'm not stupid. I don't put my head in the sand and pretend that you didn't teach that moral lesson to Hamas, and that the US didn't teach that moral lesson to Iraqis, and that moral lesson was not taught by colonialism to indigenous and native populations for decades and centuries. I'm not willing to act as a dunce for your party to go on. I'm not willing to be the clown so you can continue enjoying your party and your celebration. All the clowns that say, yes, yes, condemn Hamas, and that's the end of it. Yes, I condemn Hamas, so what? But what is the reasonable cost? So don't take the high moral ground. You're morally repulsive. Because none of your position withstand moral scrutiny. I am searching for ethics and morality that can fit, whether white or dark, whether Muslim or heathen, whether believer or non-believer. I am searching for an ethics that can apply equally to all as human beings. I do not embrace the logic of exceptionalism, but you do. You do. You're deeply enraged when you see a white person killed, but you hardly pause. You hardly care when the murdered person is a Palestinian, is an Arab, is a Muslim, is a dark-skinned human being. Lindsey Graham said, this is a religious war. Israel, wipe them out. Do I look at you and say, the American people, you've elected a fascist to power. American people, you are all culpable. American people, you must all pay a price for a murderous fascist fanatic who is uttering foul language. Moral discernment teaches me that Lindsey Graham doesn't represent even the people who elected him. I would not hold them, even the people who voted for him. But you don't extend the same courtesy to us dark-skinned people. You don't extend the same courtesy to Muslims. For you, one Muslim who commits a misdeed, all Muslims must apologize for. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم واسأل الله يستجيب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. In the midst of all of this, as innocent human beings are being slaughtered, and I'm saying human beings because that's what matters, not that they're Palestinian. As innocent children, I have seen more dead children in these past 3 weeks than I can possibly erase from my tormented mind. I have seen their pictures, living and happy, celebrating birthdays, being hugged by their parents, posing with their brothers and sisters. And then I've seen pictures of their mutilated bodies. I've seen their names. I've seen their ID numbers. Unfortunately, those who actually care about human rights, we have repeatedly asked the Israeli authorities for the children that have the names and IDs of the children have been killed. And the Israeli authorities have not supplied Human Rights Watch or any other human rights organization that I am aware of with the names and ID numbers of the children that they claim have been killed by Hamas. Why is it important? Because human rights organizations are supplying this evidence to the International Criminal Court and urging the International Criminal Court to investigate and to pass down indictments, including against Hamas personnel. But Netanyahu's word or Ismail Haniyeh's word is not enough. In this field, we need evidence. And we go out of our way to seek evidence, to document evidence. But in the midst of all of that, believe it or not, the guardian, the country that serves as the guardian of the two holy sites, the country of Mecca and Medina, the country that is supposed to represent all Muslims, is celebrating the launching of its new entertainment season, announcing the impressive lists of singers and dancers that are coming to Saudi. They launched the Atari competitions. That's like PlayStation and Xbox. They are in festive celebrations. Saudi TV, you could hardly tell by watching Saudi TV that anything is going on in Gaza. All that Saudi TV, Israel is constantly, Israeli TV is actually too much. They constantly have people talking about Gaza, Gaza, Gaza. Saudi TV and Emirati TV, but particularly Saudi TV, you'd think nothing is going on. Emirati TV actually mirrors Israeli discourse about Palestinians. That's the reasonable price that they have to pay for terrorism. They called it upon themselves. Palestinians are the ones to blame for their own misery because it's their fault. That's Emirati TV. But I keep getting messages from Muslims saying, what do we do? There is no magic potion. No one can tell you, here is the miraculous solution. What you can do is be active. If there are demonstrations, you join these demonstrations. If there are petitions, you join these petitions. You go to any active organization and offer your help to them and see if they can put you to use. But even more fundamentally, and in my opinion, more importantly, commit to transforming yourself. 1, commit to the moral realization that the Saudi government, that the Emirati government are morally reprehensible and that they do not represent you as a Muslim. 2, commit to the moral realization and principled stand that anyone, any religious figure, any religious voice that is supported or aided or who aids or supports the Emirati and Saudi governments doesn't represent you, and that you do not at all allow yourself to be influenced or otherwise persuaded by them. 3rd, commit to being the best Muslim you can. Commit to success. Commit to being a successful Muslim who perfects whatever they achieve. Because the position we are in, we need as many successful and accomplished Muslims as we can possibly have. We need Muslims in every aspect of life who are at the top of their field, who, when the time comes where they can help their ummah because they are successful in whatever field they achieve, they will in fact and indeed be able to help their ummah. You want the best response to what is happening in Gaza right now, other than donating money and going to demonstrations and things like that? Excellence. The response is excellence. Commit to excellence as a Muslim. Commit to being a committed achiever, the best in your field that you can possibly be. and commit to Allah that when called upon to help fellow Muslims, to stand up against tyranny, to help in the overthrow of corrupt rulers all over the Muslim world, to the supporting of democracies and just government all over the Muslim world, that you will do so in every possible way you can. That is the best response. Allahumma afu anna. Allahumma aghfir lana. Allahumma arhamna. اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا. اللهم ارحم أهل غزة يا رب. اللهم صبر أهل غزة يا رب. اللهم انصر أهل غزة يا رب. وأقم الصلاة. لا إله إلا الله.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا